Hello. Good evening. I want to thank you all for coming tonight to our lecture series. I'm Kay Hogan. I'm president of the Preservation Society, and I just want to remind you that this is part of a series in which we are celebrating the 250th anniversary of the Robert Longhouse. We started celebrating this in January, and here we are in May. We have two more lectures to look forward to, and we also have a fundraiser that is going to be particularly dedicated to the Robert Longhouse, which we have hoped to have just before the Fun Festival. It's the classic fundraiser for the Preservation Society, and the idea is to upgrade the heating and cooling system in the Robert Longhouse, to refurbish it, to bring it back to its glory days. And with that, I'm going to turn you over to David, who is going to introduce our speaker. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for coming. And as Kay said, this is the second in a series of 4 lectures to commemorate the completion of the Robert Longhouse in 1765. Our first speaker, Ed Pappenfuss, talked about the economic development of Fells Point in the late 18th and early 19th century, and described Fells Point as a boom town. Money could be made here. People came from all parts of the Atlantic seaboard to be in Fells Point to make their fortunes. Many of the great fortunes were built on shipping. They were on shipbuilding and related maritime activities. Everyone who came to Fells Point could, whatever they wanted to do, they could do. There were no prohibitions on anything. So our second lecture tonight, or our second lecture in the series, we have Dr. Helena Hicks, who will talk a little bit more about in depth about African Americans who lived in Fells Point in the 18th and early 19th century and how they contributed to this economic boom in Fells Point. Dr. Hicks is well known in both academic and historic preservation circles in Baltimore. She has a PhD in public policy from University of Maryland, as well as degrees from Harvard and Morgan State University. She's had teaching appointments at University of Baltimore and Baltimore City College, and has had numerous positions with the Department of Human Resources with the federal government Department of Health and Welfare. As a part of Dr. Hicks's involvement in the community, she was among an early group of students at Morgan State at the time, who staged an early sit-in at the Reed's drugstore, and this was the sort of the forerunner of the sit-ins that happened in the South through the 1950s and 1960s. So with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Hicks, and if you would please welcome her to this lecture series.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. I had the misfortune of getting a stress fracture. So as my daughter told me, she said, "You really are the little old lady in tennis shoes," because tennis shoes are all I can put on until it heals. I was delighted to do this lecture because I find myself having to give people information about Baltimore and African American involvement in it all the time. I want to clarify one thing in the beginning, and that is that Baltimore City always had a large number of what we say free blacks. It was not a place where you had to worry about slaves. Slave ships came here and were serviced, and slaves were kept in a pen, and then the ships were reloaded and taken down. The slaves were taken down to New Orleans. But as tiny as the houses are, I've said to people, well, unless you had them floating on the harbor out there, there couldn't have been many because there was no place for them to be kept. People from Baltimore County, Harford County, but more likely Baltimore County, since Baltimore City was a part of Baltimore County, were more likely to bring slaves in to work on the harbor and the ships, because we would have as many as 50 or 60 ships come in over the course of a year that needed all kinds of work on them. They were wooden, so they needed a lot of refurbishing, repairing, unloading, loading, and so forth. The thing about Baltimore is that everybody's eye, regardless of where they came from, was on making a dollar and trying to build a city. So we had people who lived next door to each other, worked together, ate together, and there was no racial discrimination during this period of time that I have been given to talk about tonight. At the end of it, that time, the end of the mid-1860s, we started to have problems. But initially, there were no problems. African Americans were here. I can trace them all the way back to the early 1600s. If you go back to Virginia, where a lot of them came, in 1660 or maybe 1670, all African Americans who were manumitted or set free, however they set them free, had to leave the county within 6 months to a year. So they came here. As part of my family used to say all the time, when I look at the Revolutionary War records, and they say it was 12 hours ride to come by ship from the northern neck of Virginia to Baltimore City. So you had a constant flow of free blacks coming here. In fact, there were some who were farmers. They went home to Virginia and they farmed this time of year. And when it got cold, they came back to Baltimore and worked on a harbor all winter and then went back to their farms. That got to be a problem for Maryland and Virginia because they could never calculate their population. People were coming and going all the time. So Virginia started with a law that said, excuse me, if you leave and you stay away as long as 3 months, you're no longer a citizen. And then Maryland did the same thing, hoping to control that constant flow of back and forth traffic. Well, it didn't work because there was nobody out there counting people and stopping them and documenting, but it probably looked good on the books and it probably satisfied people who were anxious to get an accurate count of the number of citizens that we had. Two things that were interesting when you look at the early statistics, you cannot tell who African Americans were. One of the reasons was because when they thought it was an African American, they would call them mulattoes, and they separated them out. That is a French word, and it means a mixture of, guess what? French and Indian. So the French who came in 1619 to Virginia mixed with the Indian tribes that were there, and so you got the word mulatto. And people could then decided to use it to mean a mixture of any two races. But initially, that's what it was. And so when you look at the count of mulattoes, you're not looking at people who had married black people or white people. You're looking at a whole different group of people. There are so many, enormous number of African Americans, and I'm going to give you the history of one family in particular, who had started out in that mulatto category, and they have family still living in Baltimore City today, and I'm one of them. So we started out in Virginia that way. So you could never, when people said this is how many blacks that were here, or Negroes, or whatever word they want to use, you always have to look at it with a jaundiced eye. Because if you don't want to have an argument about by saying, well, how do you know that? You know, and they may say, well, it's such and such a record. But you have to remember the records didn't take account of what the word really meant. It was a tremendous Native American population in Maryland and in Baltimore County especially, always has been, and many of them came down to work on the waterfront. They were what was called the Piscataway / Conoy tribes. They were the largest Indian tribe in this area. So most African Americans who have early beginnings in the city of Baltimore are somehow tied into that tribe. And if I could read you, we don't have time for all of that, the list of names, you would believe it because you say, well, I know somebody with that last name. Typical Piscataway, Conoy folk. They were distinguished a lot by appearance because we think of Indians as being brown, and many of them were not brown. They were fair, and many of them were not only fair, but they had green eyes. And so when you look at some African Americans now, and you see that they're fair with green eyes, you know that's probably their background. So you had African Americans here. We call them that. They weren't from Africa. They came in from Baltimore County, the area now that we would call Pikesville, Scotts Level, that area, and from Carroll County. We had some that came down as far up as Harford County. And then there were others who came up from the Eastern Shore and from other parts of the state. So there's always been a huge population here of African Americans who had questionable identity. People didn't care. If you could work and you did a good job, you were fine. There was very little housing. People had to put their own houses up, as you know, wooden structures, and they live near one another. Tremendous waterway problems, water everywhere. So if you could find a place that you could build on, you just cut down the trees that were there and you made a house. The houses were often just one room, sleeping room, mostly, and they cooked in the yard. If they cooked, they cooked in the yard. What happened with the African Americans is the same thing that happened to white Americans who arrived here. They had the same kind of living style. There were no rich people for a long time. There was no money. So you didn't have a distinction between houses. You couldn't tell. People lived where they could. The other thing is that we took the English word alley streets, and what was the alley street? A alley street was a pathway. The alley was a pathway, and the occupants who lived at the end of the alley or in the alley just lived behind a major street. In England, when you look at those small pathways, alley streets, it was not just for servants, it was for anybody who didn't want to live on a main street. As we built up, people had housing over top of their shops when we got to that point. But initially, all you had was maybe 2 rooms, at the most 2 rooms up and 2 rooms down, so that people didn't live over top their businesses. Many of the businesses were outside of the house. People worked on the waterfront. They worked on the ships. They worked in ironworks, which was always an early occupation here. So the concept of having a separate building just for commerce was something that came later on. When that concept developed, there were many African Americans who had shops as well. I guess everybody knows that my constant battle with Reed's Drugstore and the Super Block, and it's in court now. And one of the things that I held it off for a long time, I was kind of angry because they didn't ask me to testify. And I said to them, do you realize that the Super Block had, in the 1800s, had all African American store owners on it, and people lived over top those stores. So they didn't believe me. I finally got the Daily Record, hopefully it'll be out soon, to do an article on that block and the businesses that were there. Oyster houses, liveries, what we call a cook shop, which is a forerunner of restaurants, and that is an African concept. In Fells Point, you had a cook shop, and I'm going to pull out the name of one of the earliest cook shop owners. If people were working all day and they had no kitchen at home, you stopped on your way home and you had what we all know, lunch pails, and you stopped at the cook shop and you got your food and you went home. The owner of the cook shop might be male, might be female. What they cooked up was whatever was available. If they shot rabbits, you got rabbits. If they shot pheasant, you got pheasant. And you got it mixed with vegetables and whatnot. So that was how people not only managed, but that was how you got to have, because cook shops were all African Americans owned the cook shops. So that's how you got your food supply. They typically were cook shop owners. What can I tell you about them? I could tell you that many of them, many of them had relatives living with them. People lived together because they couldn't afford, first of all, even if they could find a house to live in, because there was no, like we have now, a house to rent or a house to buy. If you needed a house, you put it up and you lived in it yourself, or someone else, a carpenter, because carpenters were anybody who worked with wood. Didn't matter whether they worked on a ship, whether they built a house or whatever. That was the generic name for anybody who worked with wood. You couldn't afford often to keep it on your own. So you had relatives who came and stayed with you and lived with you. It was predominantly a male society because of the waterfront. Women did other tasks. Women were often the cook shop owners. Women were often the washerwomen who did the clothing, the laundry, for many of the men who worked on the ships. Women eventually, as families, as people got married and you had families, were often the nursemaids or the caretaker for children, both black and white. So they did not work on the waterfront per se, unless they were a owner of a cook shop. And it's interesting that they had those cook shops. One of the first ones was on a dock. I brought the maps and I was trying to figure out how that was constructed, but I guess a dock is big enough if you only need a small room to cook in. I guess the dock could accommodate cook shops. And so there were some cook shops on some of the early docks. The other thing is that African Americans, in a way, preserve their history, not just the Indian side of it, but the side of it when you finally did get some slaves who were sold into Baltimore County to, because you did eventually have a different level of economic level in Baltimore County with the big planters and whatnot. They had African Americans who worked for them. I can tell you that it's far into this present day that as a child in the 40s, I used to watch the wagon come in to Orleans and Broadway, and it was the spot to pick up day workers, and they would pick up mostly African Americans, take them out to Baltimore County where they worked in the fields all day, and then return them in the evening to houses that they lived in this area, in the Fells Point area. I have names of many, many families. You would be surprised the backgrounds of some of the people you hold in high esteem. I've never talked to her about it, but I don't have to, because if it's history is history. And if you have feelings about your place in history, that's a personal thing. But history is public. But Dr. Patricia Smoke, Kurt Smoke's wife, she was a Locks. William Locks was one of the first African Americans to have a business in Fells Point. That was in the 1700s. I bring that up simply because the family's still here. And they had like a grocery store in Fells Point in the 1700s. There are other people whose names I could bring up that would ring a bell with you. Some of them don't know they have that history. Some of them do, but some of them don't even realize that's who their predecessors were, and that's what they did. So we have generations of African Americans who were here in the 1700s. Some came as early as the 1600s, who have continued to stay here. And my family is one of them. We've been here. We came in the country in 1642 in Virginia and came up to Baltimore City, ran a coach service, and we're still here. So all free blacks, no ties, because the one thing that this country did was not allow Indians to be enslaved. So if you had any kind of Indian heritage, you never got to be a slave. Now that says nothing about treatment when you get further up the line, and we know that. But as far as record keeping, one of the reasons you can't find those names is because they could not be labeled as slaves. They weren't slaves. They could not be enslaved if they had any Indian background. And there are a lot of us here, a whole lot of us here, who go back that far. What did they do? They did the traditional kinds of things that you do on the waterfront. They were carpenters. They worked in the ironworks. They had a number of skills. How did they acquire them? Well, you acquire skills over time. As countries merged or fought and acquired captives and whatnot, skills began to infiltrate many, many groups of people. So you had, when they started bringing people in from Africa, and because that's a huge continent, the coast, the western coast, I think, is where the first ones came from. Many of them they lived on the water, and they had those same skills when they came here because they had used them in their growing up years. And people always amazed me when they said, some of these people could read and write. I said, but you know, if they came through Europe and stayed in a length of time, you must remember if they came through something we call the apprenticeship system, they all had to learn to read and write because that was a requirement of keeping an apprentice. And that is the other avenue that brought many African Americans to this place called Fells Point. They came as apprentices. Now, that's part of a doctoral dissertation I did, 1987. You can find it, and I have since cleaned it up a little bit, not as much as I'd like to. So it is, a copyrighted book, copyrighted information, therefore it is available to the public. But many came as apprentices, and they were apprenticed in all the fields you can think of, all the crafts they were apprenticed in. The contribution of African Americans who came from Africa was in terms of many of the decorations that you see, or the decorative work you see on buildings around, the old buildings you see around the city, because they were very much into decorating buildings and to differentiating between buildings by their decorations. So if you go someplace, how many people have been recently to Old Town Mall? Oh, I would know Johns Hopkins would raise his hand. Well, if you look at the columns there, have you ever noticed they're decorated? You've never looked at them. Look at them and see all the images and decorations they have on there. That's African American art. Early African American art. Nobody really identifies it or really talks about it. So that's your new piece of information. One of your new pieces of information is that's African American art. And there's a lot of it all around the city. Now, they didn't all come here from the coast of Africa. Many African Americans, when they came through the Caribbean and then came here. One of the earliest architects, and we at Johns Hopkins knows that we've had this fight in city government about the building on the superblock that used to be the old McCroy's, the little funny-looking building with the decorations on it. People attribute it to everybody else. It was done by Charles Cassell. Charles Cassell was a black architect, and when I remember we had the discussion, they said, he looks like a swarthy Italian. And I said, that's because of his Indian background. That's a typical Piscataway, Kanoi appearance. But Charles Cassell was not white. Charles Cassell goes into that big category where we dump everybody who's not white, all non-whites, and call them African Americans, and that's who he was. There are pieces of the Cassell family still here in D.C. and in Baltimore City today, and it was interesting talking to the elder members of that family and getting them to tie down my whole interest in the fact that they really were responsible for that building, because they came here in 1795. The other thing you have to remember with Baltimore City and its floods and its fires, the records for many buildings, many populations, etc., are gone. And we have tried to piece them together. How I pieced them together, and I'll tell you this for anybody who's doing research, I use the National Archives. which always kept a record. There was nothing we had here that they didn't have there. You're looking, you're looking at me strange. But the National Archives can tell you more about the background of people and of buildings in Fells Point than you will find, unfortunately, in the Maryland Historical Society or in Ena Pratt Library. And tell you interesting things about them in terms of where they came from, how many people were in the household. It's an early census, that's what it is. By the time we got around to doing census, if the census taker, people are working, if the census taker could find the person, then they got included. Many people didn't get included. If they were part of that group that went back and forth to Virginia, they most likely did not get included. But that census, all the early census are to a large extent incorrect. If you want to get a picture, a total picture of how many people lived here in Fells Point and who they were, because they just didn't have the ability to get that information. It wasn't like they could go in the main office of the business and look at the payroll and whose names were on there. Most people had their own business, in the sense that if you were a drayman or if you were a water pilot, you were not attached to anybody else. That was your occupation. That's what you did day by day, and you weren't responsible to anybody else. So it is hard to track people who are, and it's hard now, it was impossible then. So you never really know, when you look at that census, you're always shocked at how many people we have missed in terms of early African Americans. The fact that we were not a society, Fells Point was not a society of people who were concerned about racial identification. They were concerned about building a city, making a living, and so it didn't matter to them. It became an issue in later years, but not initially. So you can't always tell who people were. You can't tell what their ethnicity was by looking at early census. And I've seen lots of articles, and I've had friends, librarians, etc., who give me information about them. And yes, that was recorded. If they talked to the person, they probably did get accurate information. The problem is there were so many people that you missed. And so you don't have an idea, really, of what your population was. But as I said, free blacks were here in large numbers from the 1600s on. And if you ever want to spend some time in D.C., it's nice weather, and just go over there and stay for a while. I think the National Archives open some nights until 9 o'clock, and thumb through them. Many of them come out of the Revolutionary War records, because the Revolutionary War required for a pension a written account of who you were and where you came from, in addition to all your battle activity. So the information is there. It's has just not been written up in any large detail. And I have stacks of information, and I said I was going to write it, but you know, it's a lot of light things you say you're going to do, and you never get around to doing it. And then I woke up one day, and I got to be old. And I know I'm not writing it now. So one of the reasons I wanted to come here was I would hope that this presentation will help you to encourage and to excite some younger writers, some younger historians, some younger researchers to go into those documents and get a better picture of African Americans who were in this area, since this was the first area in Baltimore, very early Baltimore. Now, as we moved up, as we got more into census records, and they became a little more accurate, because we had public buildings, and we had schools, and we had churches, places where records were kept, it became easier to distinguish people, and it became easier to identify African Americans. Church records are wonderful. Churches have some of the best kept records I've ever seen. They really are very good. If you go to the cathedral, when they brought people in from Canada, really Nova Scotia, here to Baltimore, because of that Catholic background, many of them attended the cathedral here in Baltimore. So if you want to know who some of them were, who were early in this city, the cathedral has some of those records, as well as other early churches. And of course, I look at John's, and he knows that the Quakers have wonderful records of who many of those people were and what they did, because the Quakers were instrumental in starting schools for them and other aspects of elevating their lives in terms of access to a better way of life, access to not just education, but to employment, to things like housing that had toilet facilities in it, and I could go on and on and on. But they do have very good records, and they do have a good identification of some of the early African Americans, because they worked on behalf of them. They came down from Philadelphia, and they took on as a mission to try to improve the lot of early African Americans. And they were successful in that. We know that from the McKim School and from other kinds of activities that housing and so forth that Quakers were responsible for. And the fact that they put up a library, which has always been, no matter how long we had segregation, Ina Pratt Library has always been open to everybody. So that whatever they did, they made sure the entire population had access to it. They had no discriminatory laws about anything that they gave to the general public that would elevate the level of education and just elevate society in general. So that's another place where there are good records. I just wanted to tell you about a few people. You would not think that you had people who were mariners. I look at a gentleman named George Chambers, and he lived in Fells Point, and that's what he did. He was a black mariner. He lived on Goodman Street. I look at people like James Cannon and Edward Williamson, who were black ship carpenters. And a ship carpenter had a kind of special place, because that meant he knew enough about carpentry to work on all parts of the ship. He didn't just do rigging, or he didn't just do interiors or exteriors. He was able, I guess, to build a ship and to know that you had African Americans with that kind of ability. And then I look at somebody like Thomas Brown, and that family has been here forever. He was a clothier. He lived near Hughes Dock, or Hughes's as early African Americans call that street. He lived near Hughes's Dock. And he was a clothier. He made clothes. He amassed a good bit of money. And in 1792, he ran for the House of Delegates. So when I say to you, there was not the discriminatory practices that we know in later years, that's a good example. He ran for the House of Delegates in 1792. And he owned a great deal of property from 1776 up to 1807, and then I lost track of him, couldn't find him. He owned property in Fellsport, houses. He couldn't live in but one, so he had property that he rented out to others.
I'm going to give you this and make you yell because we're going to turn the air conditioning on, Dr. Hicks.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I didn't know what your specific interest was in terms of early African Americans. I can move on up to people like William Moody, who was a physician on Argyle Alley at Wilkes, early African American physician. And he was there until 1822. And he serviced the community. We could look at Thomas Green, who was a barber. He rented and sold commercial real estate. He had a business partner that was white. So it was no discrimination when it came to making money, and actually there isn't very much of one now. If something is a profitable enterprise, you can find people of all ethnicities who will join together to make money. There was a point around the early 1800s when the state of Maryland wanted to stop the number of African Americans coming into the state, and so they invented the Certificate of Freedom in 1805. And what it was supposed to do was to make sure that if you were on the streets and someone stopped you, they could identify you as an African American, and it was like freedom papers. So if you had escaped from one of those slave pens, or if you had escaped from someplace in Baltimore County or the Eastern Shore as a slave, you could then be picked up. The interesting thing about the judicial system in the city, and of course it started here, they did a lot of trying to identify people in Fells Point because the waterfront provided a mass of jobs. And if people wanted to come in and be free, they had to find a way to survive. So many of them worked on the waterfront. Nobody ever asked them whether they were free or not. They asked, do you know how to bang a nail with a hammer? And successfully, and you were hired. So they did a lot of stopping people in this area who were African Americans to try to pick up escaped slaves. But it was never Maryland, or at least not Baltimore's, priority. So that the number of so-called escaped slaves that they picked up was so small until it became a law in the books that was just that, just a law in the books. There were no efforts to really worry about it. If this person could work, I'm not going to turn them in as an escaped slave when I need this ship finished for sailing, and you're able to help me get it in shape for sailing, either to build it, repair it, or to launch it. If you're unloading a ship and I need a water pilot to take my goods, remember you had waterways all through downtown Baltimore, and I need to get stuff up to Lexington Market, and I can get it up there in what we would now call a rowboat. You are a water pilot, fine. Load your boat, take it up to the market. I want to move from that point to talking about a bigger contribution of African Americans when Baltimore decided that they wanted to be free from the supervision, control, etc., all those not nice words, from Baltimore County. So what they did was to stop for 3 days in hot August. They would not unload any of the produce sent in by wagons from Baltimore County farmers to be put on the ships or distributed to the markets. They, for 3 days, refused to touch it. So you can imagine, it must have been a wonderful smell with all that food rotting there. Well, it was all the workers in Baltimore City who refused to unload those boats or to load those boats. If you had this large majority there of African Americans who did that work, obviously they were part of that group that said, we won't do it either. And so because they joined together as a group of Baltimoreans and not in terms of any differences in economics or race, we got our freedom from Baltimore County in 1787 by refusing to help them with their economics, which we got no return from. That's what it was all about. They would not give us sewage control. They would not give us anything that represented a better living environment. They wouldn't share the wealth. That's what it amounted to. So we were able as a group, and Fells Point being the heart of the city's economic industry of shipbuilding and shiploading and shipping industry, as well as ironworks and other economics endeavors, was all a part of that. And there was, you cannot tell, they said all of the workers stopped for 3 days. There was no count of how many were African Americans or how many of them were Irish, or how many of them were Germans or whatever. It was just all the workers in Baltimore City. And that's how we got to be a city. And we got to be a city after the tyranny that Baltimore County had us under. We became an independent city. Every other city you go to in this country is a part of some other division, a county, mostly a county, but some other larger body, except Baltimore City. And we are responsible for ourselves. We've always had that kind of independent air, and it permeated the whole culture. The need or the drive for independence was also a big factor in African Americans remaining a self-sustaining population. So when you get to the 1800s, and I'm going to have to close and I'll answer some questions, you find that African Americans use their funds to build their own churches, to build their own schools, to build their own charity organizations, and to build their own social institutions, which almost always had a charitable side of them, like the Independent Order of the Odd Fellows, which is one of the oldest African American societies in the city. And I'm trying to link in your minds the fact that if those people now, even though they were moving further than Fells Point into other parts of the city as they opened up, this was their starting ground. They or the generations before them. And that's one of the ways you can tell that that is because we can link those names all the way up to the present day of African Americans who started here and worked and then were eventually able to move on to live in other parts of the city and make a contribution to not only the city as a whole, but also in terms of independence, taking care of their own, having their own, not in a discriminatory fashion, but just to have their own. The Irish did the same thing. The Germans did the same thing. It's a natural part of humanity. You take pride in who you are, and so you do things together to exhibit to the world that you are able to coalesce and to have your own. So that's pretty much what I have to say. I have a lot of information, there's, which I can give you because you can't do it all in this little bit of time. But I certainly will entertain any questions you have about anything that I've said or any curiosity you have about African Americans and Fells Point. Yes, take this, please.
You mentioned Thomas Brown, the clothier who ran for the House of Delegates in 1792. Did blacks who lived in Fells Point, did they have voting rights at this time?
Did they have
And
what?
Did they have voting rights?
Yes, it's a interesting, that's a good question, because I have not published any of this information, so it's still out there for somebody to take that on. The voting rights in this city are very interesting, because there were times when blacks voted, and there were periods of times when they took away the vote. So you have this back and forth kind of thing. At the time Thomas Brown came along, yes, we voted. There were other periods when they took that right away, and then they gave it back again. And I guess that's a whole research into the politics, what made them move it back and forth, what they were really after as a city or as a state, which I have not taken on, but would be an interesting research project for somebody to look at. Yes?
I know that Frederick Douglass was the architect for 3 houses.
You have to speak up because I
I
can't
know
hear.
that Frederick Douglass was the architect for 3 houses not far from here. But I wonder, how active was he and Isaac Myers in this area, and were they active during the time period that you mentioned from 1760 to 1860?
Well, yes, they were, and Frederick Douglass did live in Fells Point. And yes, Frederick Douglass and Isaac Myers, the whole group, the Chesapeake, you're talking about the Chesapeake Marine Dry Dock Company, which I knew well because my family was involved in that as well. They lived in this area, and they did what people did in reaction to being shut out. They developed their own. Nobody protested against them having their own. People say, fine, if you want your own, go for it. So they were able to be in a really free society where racial discrimination did not exist, at least not any way that we can document it, so they could develop the Chesapeake Marine and Dry Dock Society. They wanted ownership. Well, if they were all white, there would be a fight if you want ownership. We see it on Wall Street all the time. We've just been through it with the cable industry. You want to take over what I consider my business that I'm making a fortune out of. We will have to come to some agreement, or else we're going to have a fight. Somebody's going to win because I'm going to try to hold on to what I have. So the Chesapeake Marine Dry Dock Society was a effort for blacks to own. They had worked in the shipping all these years to own their own shipping business. It didn't last that long, maybe about 6 years. And for many reasons, it fell apart. William Locks was a part of that group. I had a cousin, uncle, Walter Sorrell, cousin Cosman Gaines, who were a part of it as well. If you look at those kinds of developments in the city, you're going to find that they all link back to early African American families, and many of whom still have members in today's society, as I do. That's one of the ways I know so much about early African American history, because I'm old enough to have been acquainted with a number of those people. My father had this thing that he would do. He would take my brother and I every Sunday afternoon to go visit family. We'd go visit, and I guess it might have been pervasive throughout the community anyway, regardless of who you were. And so we'd go visit elderly relatives, and I got to hear the stories. I got to hear also the argument of why it broke up. Even though I've seen the articles on it, I said, but you should talk to some of us who are descendants, and we could fill you in on what really happened with that whole operation. So, yes, the answer to your question, the long answer to your question is yes. Anybody else? Yes.
Yes, I just wanted to make a comment, Dr. Hicks. I'm so glad to have heard you speak tonight, because your comments that there was not much difference between the African Americans living in Fells Point and the other groups, Irish, German, Jewish, Bohemian, whoever, and that their styles of life were duplicated and the way that they moved up, because that duplicated my research decades ago, and lately I've been hearing a big emphasis on the slave trade here, and leaving out what you said tonight. So I was just delighted to hear you.
The slave trade was an outside piece, of Baltimore history. I call it that because we weren't interested in it, except that we serviced the ships. But we were not a part of it. You didn't have any groups of people who were involved in that slave trade who lived in Fells Point. Hope Slattery, yes, he was an outsider. I mean, whites didn't want any parts of him either. And as I said, they never turned in runaway slaves. It wasn't worth it to them. They were a true society that believed in equality, and they practiced it in many ways. And the more of that history you read, the more you realize that's what it had to be. Otherwise, our history would have been very different.
Dr. Hicks, we'd like to thank you for your very insightful everybody to join us downstairs for reception. And in October, the lecture series will pick up again. We were having Dean Baker, who was a professor of history at Baltimore College, talk about take the story one step beyond. Helena Hicks brings us up to the Civil War. Gene Baker will talk about Fells Point after the Civil War and the wave of immigrants that came from Eastern Europe and began to change yet again the nature of Fells Point and the people who lived and worked here. But always keep in mind, people came to Fells Point to make money. And that was their, as most people, came, they developed things, they built things, they were interested in making money. So that is probably the lesson of Fells Point, an economic engine that even drives us today. So thank you very much for coming.